The church was filled with whispers and judgment that day. A young widow, her baby clutched tightly to her chest, had just buried the love of her life. Instead of comfort, she was met with cold stares and cruel hands, dragged out of the very place where she came seeking peace. Her tears fell heavier than the rain outside, her cries echoing louder than the organ's final hymn. But what happened next would silence every voice that had condemned her. Because just as she thought her world had ended, a stranger, a millionaire, stepped in and changed everything in the most unexpected way. The church smelled faintly of lilies, a bitter reminder that they had not been brought for celebration but for farewell. The heavy wooden doors had closed with a thud behind her, shutting her into a space that suddenly felt more like a courtroom than a house of God. She held her baby tightly against her chest, the child squirming softly, unaware of the sorrow that had engulfed their small world. Every eye seemed to follow her as she made her way down the aisle, her black dress clinging to her like a shadow. Grief was supposed to bring people together, but instead it had isolated her, wrapping her in an invisible wall of judgment. She could feel the weight of whispers pressing into her back. They were not whispers of comfort, not gentle condolences, but sharp-edged rumors cutting into her already bleeding heart. When the pastor's voice broke through the silence to begin the funeral prayers, she tried to focus on the words. She wanted to cling to the hope of peace, to the memory of the man she had lost, to the promises they had made to each other in happier times. But each word felt drowned out by the unspoken questions around her. Why was she here? Did she belong? The pews were filled with people who had known her husband his entire life, people who thought they knew his story better than she ever could. To them, she was an outsider, an intruder who had no rightful place by his coffin. As she sat clutching her child, she tried to hold herself together. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. Sleepless nights of weeping had left her drained, her eyes swollen, her heart fractured. Yet even in her brokenness, she tried to stay strong for the little one who whimpered softly against her chest. Every time the baby shifted, someone turned their head, disapproving. A crying infant at a funeral, they thought, was an interruption, a distraction. But they did not see that this child was the last living piece of the man lying in that coffin, the only fragment of him she had left. When the final hymn began, she closed her eyes and let the voices wash over her. For a brief moment, she felt connected again to the memory of her husband. She remembered his laughter, his gentle words, the way he had once promised that no matter what storms came, he would never let her face them alone. Now he was gone, and she was left to stand in the storm by herself. The hymn ended, and silence fell again, the kind of silence that suffocates more than it soothes. Then it happened. A cold hand gripped her arm. At first, she thought it was someone offering support, someone guiding her to stand and say her last goodbye. But the fingers tightened, rough and unkind. She looked up into eyes that carried not pity but disdain. "You shouldn't be here," the voice hissed, low but sharp enough for others nearby to hear. She tried to pull back, confused, her voice trembling as she whispered, "This is my husband's funeral." But her protest was swallowed by another set of hands that pushed against her shoulder, urging her out of the pew. The baby stirred and began to cry, sensing the panic rising in her chest. She tried to soothe the child, rocking gently, whispering desperate words of comfort, but the noise only seemed to fuel the anger of those around her. People began to murmur louder, some shaking their heads, others looking away as if her pain was something shameful they could not bear to witness. No one stepped forward to defend her. No one reminded the others that grief has no rules, that love has no conditions. Instead, the whispers grew into a collective force, a tide of judgment that rose higher and higher until she felt as though she were drowning. Dragged to her feet, she stumbled, clutching her baby tightly to her chest as though shielding the little one from the cruelty of the world. The wooden floor creaked under her hurried steps as they forced her toward the back. Her voice broke into sobs, pleading, begging to be allowed to stay, but her words fell on ears that had already decided her fate. In that moment, she realized that grief was not the only burden she would carry. Alongside her sorrow, she was now forced to bear humiliation. The church doors opened, and the chill of the outside air rushed in, mingling with her tears. She was pushed into the brightness of the day, her cries echoing in the open space as the doors slammed shut behind her. For a long moment, she stood frozen on the steps, her baby wailing in her arms. The sound of the hymn still lingered faintly from inside, mocking her with its message of mercy and forgiveness. She wanted to scream at the hypocrisy of it all, to demand why compassion was reserved for some but denied to her. But her voice was broken, choked by the sobs that shook her shoulders. She sank onto the cold stone steps, her strength finally giving way. Her body curled protectively around her child as though shielding them from the cruelty of the world outside and the merciless rejection inside. Her mind replayed the moments she had shared with her husband, each memory now tinged with the bitterness of loss. She remembered the way his hand had fit perfectly around hers, how his laughter could light up the darkest day, how he had promised her a life filled with love. All of it had been ripped away too soon, and now even the dignity of mourning him was denied. The baby's cries softened into hiccups, small gasps that broke her heart even more. She rocked gently, humming through her tears, trying to create a cocoon of safety in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. Her vision blurred as she looked down the street, seeing faces pass by, strangers who glanced at her with curiosity but did not stop. To them, she was just another broken woman on the church steps, her story unknown and unimportant. And yet, deep inside, a tiny flicker of strength remained. She had been pushed out, humiliated, left in the cold with nothing but her child and her grief. But she still had that child. She still had love, and as she whispered a promise into her baby's ear, that she would fight, that she would endure, that she would not let the cruelty of others define their future, she felt the faintest spark of resilience take root. It was small, fragile, easily crushed by the weight of her sorrow, but it was there. And though she did not yet know it, that spark would be the beginning of a story far greater than the shame she carried in that moment. Her tears fell silently now, her sobs reduced to trembling breaths. The church doors remained shut, and inside, the funeral continued without her. But outside, on those cold stone steps, something had shifted. She had been cast out, but in that exile, she had found a raw, unfiltered truth, that sometimes the world turns its back when you need it most. And sometimes, when you least expect it, someone else, someone unexpected, steps forward to change everything. She did not know how long she had been sitting on those cold steps, her arms aching from holding the baby so tightly, her cheeks raw from the stream of tears that refused to end. The voices inside the church were muffled now, as though the walls themselves had conspired to keep her out of the only place she wanted to be. For her, time had become distorted. Every minute felt like an hour, every passing glance from a stranger another reminder that she had been cast aside. She tried to gather herself, tried to imagine what she would do next, but her mind was blank. The world that once revolved around her husband had collapsed into silence, and she could see no path forward. Then, amidst the blur of faces passing by, one figure stopped. At first, she barely noticed him. He stood a few paces away, not staring in judgment like the others, but watching with a kind of quiet intensity that unsettled her. His suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished, his presence commanding. There was nothing in his appearance that suggested he belonged on those church steps alongside a grieving widow and her child. He looked out of place, and yet, in some strange way, he seemed rooted there, as though fate itself had planted him in her path. She lowered her gaze, embarrassed by her own disheveled state. Her hair clung to her damp cheeks, her dress creased and stained from the struggle inside. She did not want pity, especially not from a stranger who could walk away at any moment. But instead of leaving, he took a step closer. His voice, when he spoke, was calm yet strong, the kind of voice that carried both authority and gentleness. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was simple, but it cut through her silence like a lifeline. She wanted to say no. She wanted to pour out the truth, that she was far from all right, that her life had been shattered, that she had just been humiliated in front of people who should have offered her comfort. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled with grief and shame. All she could manage was a shaky nod, though her trembling hands betrayed her. He crouched down to her level, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment she saw something she had not seen in anyone else since her husband's passing: genuine compassion. The baby whimpered, and instinctively he glanced down, his expression softening even more. "You've been out here too long," he said quietly, as though speaking to himself as much as to her. Without hesitation, He removed his jacket, a garment clearly expensive, and draped it gently around her shoulders. The warmth of the fabric startled her. It felt almost foreign after the cold rejection she had endured. She opened her mouth to protest, to tell him she could not accept such kindness, but he silenced her with a look that was not commanding but reassuring. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the faint cries of the baby. Then, he asked the question that had been lingering in his mind since he saw her. "Why were you put out?" His tone carried no judgment, only curiosity mixed with quiet indignation. She hesitated, unsure if she could trust this stranger with the cruel truth. But something about him, the steadiness of his gaze, the way he listened with his whole presence, made her want to speak. Her voice cracked as she told him how they had dragged her out, how the whispers of unworthiness had stung more than any physical touch, how the very place meant to offer solace had instead become the site of her deepest humiliation. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly, his eyes darkening with something she could not quite define. Anger, perhaps, but not directed at her, at the injustice she had suffered. When she finished, she lowered her head, expecting him to retreat, to decide that her story was too heavy to carry. Instead, he exhaled, slowly, as though making a decision. "They were wrong," he said firmly. "No one should treat you that way. Not here, not anywhere." The conviction in his voice startled her. He spoke not as though offering comfort but as though declaring a truth that could not be challenged. For the first time since the funeral began, she felt the faintest spark of validation, as though someone had finally seen her pain and declared it unjust. She clung to that moment like a drowning woman grasping at driftwood. The stranger's presence grew more significant with each passing second. She did not yet know who he was, why he had stopped, or why he cared. But she could not ignore the way his words carried weight, the way his actions spoke louder than the silence of those who had turned away. As the baby began to fuss again, he surprised her further by gently offering his hand. "May I?" he asked, motioning toward the child. Her first instinct was to refuse. She had clutched the baby so tightly all day, as though letting go even for a moment would mean losing the last piece of her husband. But the gentleness in his tone disarmed her. Hesitantly, she allowed him to cradle the child, watching in awe as the baby quieted almost instantly in his arms. The sight stirred something deep within her, a mix of gratitude and confusion. Who was this man who appeared out of nowhere and carried himself with such ease, as though he had been meant to arrive in her darkest moment? She asked softly, "Why are you helping me?" He looked down at the baby, then back at her, his expression unreadable yet sincere. "Because someone should," he replied simply. "And because sometimes life brings us to places where we're meant to cross paths with people who need us." She was too overwhelmed to respond. For days she had felt invisible, her suffering unnoticed, her love dismissed. Yet now, in the presence of a stranger, she felt seen, as though her pain mattered. She had no idea that he was not just any passerby but a man of immense means, someone whose wealth and influence reached far beyond what she could imagine. To her, he was simply a kind soul. But to him, this encounter was more than chance, it was a moment of decision. As the church doors opened and mourners began to spill out, he shifted slightly, shielding her from their eyes. His stance was protective, almost defiant, as though daring anyone to approach her again. And they didn't. Perhaps it was his commanding presence, or perhaps it was the silent authority that seemed to radiate from him, but no one dared utter another word against her. She noticed it then, the subtle bows of respect, the cautious glances. Whoever this man was, the world seemed to recognize him. When the coffin was finally carried out, she clutched her chest, the grief crashing over her again. He did not speak, did not attempt to soothe her with empty words. Instead, he stood beside her, the baby still in his arms, a silent pillar of strength. It was then that she realized his presence was not fleeting. He was not going to walk away once the funeral ended. He had stepped into her story, and somehow she knew he was meant to stay. What she did not yet know was that this stranger, a millionaire by status but a man of rare humanity by heart, would become the one to change the course of her life. He would lift her from despair, challenge the world that had scorned her, and show her that love, in its truest form, can appear when least expected. The cruelty of that day had pushed her into darkness, but his intervention lit a path she never imagined existed, one that would carry her far beyond the humiliation of being dragged out of a church and into a future shaped not by loss, but by the promise of hope.